Hi everyone, this is Miss Nguyen, and this lecture we're going to go over the cerebrum and briefly introduce some of the major structures in the brain. And in this lesson, again, the focus is mainly the cerebrum, though at the very first few minutes, we're going to go over some of the anatomical major structures of the brain, which are these, and then afterwards we will dive into the cerebrum. All right, so the brain itself is very interesting, and a lot of the different parts of the brain are specialized. So this is why you can sometimes have situations like this where a entire steel rod went through this man's skull, and yet he lived, and he stayed alive, and he was able to basically recover most of his motor functions, but then he underwent this really drastic personality shift as a result of this effect and the damage that occurred. And this man survived from that rot, and this was like the mid 1800s. The man's name was Phineas Gage, if you're interested in looking up his story. All right, so the brain itself, just some overall structures and functions of it. It weighs about 3 pounds, the average adult brain, and the brain overall is divided into 4 regions, and we're going to go into the functions of each of these regions between this lecture and the next one. However, anatomically speaking, there's 4 major regions: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. So the cerebrum is the largest region, broken into a left side and right side of your hemisphere, and it's connected by something called the corpus callosum, which we'll go into more later on. It's the biggest region of your brain. It's about 80% of your brain, and it's the one that people typically associate with what they think of as a brain. The other 3 regions, though, are the diencephalon, which is the interbrain or middle part of your brain, which sits right above the brainstem. The brainstem, which is kind of a stalk, like a little like stick region of the brain that kind of connects directly to the spinal cord. And then the cerebellum, which people sometimes describe as a bulbous projection at the occipital region. The occipital region is the back of your head, and the bulbous projection just means it's like a circle, a bulb, kind of in the back, and also has kind of a left and right side, aka 2 hemispheres. In terms of imaging, these are just some pictures to help you visualize. So the cerebrum itself is this entire area over here. The cerebellum, that bulbous projection that we mentioned, is the back of your brain. This is where your eyes are, okay? This is the back of your brain, the cerebellum. And then over here, this is kind of the diencephalon region. It's sort of hard to describe, so I'm just going to kind of sketch it out. This is the diencephalon region, which includes the epithalamus, which isn't drawn on these lower images, but I'll just kind of sketch it on. The hypothalamus, which is over here, and the thalamus, which is over here. And then again, we'll go over into the next lecture. And we have the brainstem. Now, it looks like this brainstem is on the inside of the brain itself, but it's not. It's just that the human brain is very curved, so in this image it makes it look like it's inside the brain, but it's actually kind of sort of a stick that's right below the cerebrum that consists of a midbrain, a pons, and a medulla oblongata. You can kind of see it a little better in this image over here. This is the brainstem. This is the diencephalon. This over here is the cerebrum, and this entire region, this entire outer region is the cerebrum. And this is a sagittal section of what the brain looks like if you cut it between the left and right side. So again, those left and right side are the hemispheres that make up the cerebrum. So left and right side. It's covered in peaks and valleys, meaning it's very wrinkled. So the puffy region is known, the mountain region is known as the gyrus, or gyri. I should say gyrus, actually. The sulcus, or the sulci, are the shallow wrinkles, the tiny wrinkles, and the very deep lines, deep grooves, are called the fissures. So if I look at this image here, most of these wrinkles are what I would call sulcus. But then you see over here, there's this really deep wrinkle over here. And then those would be more of the fissure. They're really hard to identify, though, honestly. So in terms of our class, there'll only be a few key ones that you need to recognize. Here's an image of it. Now, one of the very interesting things between the gyrus, the hills, and the sulcus, which are the shallow wrinkles, versus the fissures, which are the very deep wrinkles, is you'll also notice in these images where the gray matter and white matter are located. So it actually turns out within all those wrinkles, the outer surface edge of those wrinkles are where all your gray matter is, while the internal region is where all the white matter is. Now that actually is important because if you recall the difference between gray matter and white matter in our earlier notes is that gray matter are the unmyelinated areas, meaning that's mainly where your cell bodies are, the biggest part of your neurons, while the white matter is where all your axons are, the myelinated axons, which are the connective parts. So that means the majority of neurons' volume and processing regions are on the outer edge of your brain, which is the areas that are most likely to get smacked on the side if you hit your head. Now, another big feature that you should know the name of is between the left and right side, there's that really deep groove here, and that's called a longitudinal fissure that divides the left and right side. It's that deep division between both sides. And you'll notice in this picture, you'll see kind of the shadow underneath. That shadow is actually a band of tissue that's connecting the left side and right side so that they can share information. That's known as the corpus callosum that we mentioned earlier. So the cerebrum, which is 80% of your brain mass, that internal area is your white matter, and the outer area is the gray matter called the cerebral cortex. There's also internal areas of your gray matter. Well, we're going to mention that gray matter can sometimes jet, meaning push into the middle area. And there's also what we call islands of gray matter within as well. Now, the gray matter in your cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex. There's gray matter outside your cerebrum. They're called something else. But within your cerebrum, if it's gray matter, it's your cerebral cortex. It's the core of your cerebrum. It does all the processing, the storage and decisions of your information. That's all your cerebrum. So it contains your important processing part of your neurons, their cell bodies. So the outermost layer of your brain then has most of the cell bodies of your neurons. And the reason why you have all those wrinkles in your brain is to allow more surface area to increase the amount of space for those neuron cell bodies, or also known as soma. The basal ganglia, those little islands of gray matter in the inside of your brain, they also help allow more space for cell bodies inside your brain. And those, because they're more on the inside area where there's other coordination of movement happening, they do play a pretty big role in terms of motor control. So you actually have many parts of motor control throughout your brain. You have some reflexive motor control within the diencephalon and brainstem region, but you also have controlled motor control within those basal ganglia as well as your frontal lobe. However, the basal ganglia especially tend to be associated with Parkinson's disease. If you have damage in that area, we found out that many Parkinson's patients have it. And if you know Parkinson's disease, it's a disease where you have limited control of your body, so you end up shaking a lot and stuff like that. There's also a condition called ataxia, which is weak or uncoordinated movement that's also associated if for some reason those gray matter areas in the inside of your brain somehow get damaged. Now, all that white matter, though, those are all what I can call wires. It's all just wiring to help send the information, connect the information from all the processing areas in your gray matter and to bring it down into the middle of your brain and then bring it to your spinal cord so it can be sent out or to send that information to other parts of your brain. So that's all just wiring. That's why it's in the middle area. It helps connect all the different parts of the brain to each other and also parts of your brain down to your spine. Okay? And now that major connection piece between your right side and left side, that is a major piece of white matter called the corpus callosum, which is a major tract within the cerebrum that connects the right side to left side of your cerebral hemisphere. And again, remember, it is white because it is bundles of myelinated axons versus the gray matter, which is about your cell bodies, the processing power of your neurons, versus just sending that information somewhere else. The corpus callosum, just a reminder, is that little band of tissue between the right and left side. It also looks like this in this image. If you took a coronal or frontal section of your brain, so front from back side, you can see the connection here. If you cut the brain this way, though, the corpus callosum actually spans from the front to the back of your cerebrum. So it's actually this huge band of tissue here, that's your corpus callosum. And it's, again, connecting the left side from the right side and giving a lot of ability for them to share information back and forth. Okay, so you can actually read up on why the corpus callosum is so important if you look into people known as split brain patients. So for a while there, there were a few patients that have the left side and right side of their brains severed from each other, and they cut the corpus callosum between the two sides because that helped treat those patients' severe seizures. And as a result, we found that the left side and right side areas coordinate with one another, but also are specialized. In addition to that, we also discovered from these surgeries that the right side of your body is actually associated with the left side of your brain, and the left side of your body is associated with the right part of your brain. For some reason, the corpus callosum causes this crossing to happen. So, for instance, that can cause some issues for these patients. For instance, if they see an image in their left visual field, that means their right side of their brain sees the image. But because the left side of your brain processes speech, then if you see a picture of like your mom in your left eye, because it goes to your right brain that doesn't speak, that doesn't have the information for speaking, you can't say that you saw a picture of your mom. It's really weird. You can't say, oh, that's my mother. Anyways, and that can cause a lot of issues, so those connections between the two is really important for like full-on processing. Okay, so the brain hemispheres, those left and right side. So between the two left and right sides, in fact, they are actually anatomically very similar in terms of structures. There's nothing special about the structures themselves, but as you grow and develop over time, we found that typically certain functions tend to what we call hemispheric lateralization. They tend to specialize on either the right side or be found on the left side. And there are functions that can be done on both the right and left, but we do find that they tend to specialize. They also are typically connected by the corpus callosum, like we mentioned earlier, and it leads to this cross-wired effect where the left side affects the right side and vice versa. All right. So you may have heard of left brain versus right brain people. That's not a real thing. That's more of a myth. But we do find that typically, and not always, not for everyone, typically the left side tends to be associated more with reasoning, number processing, speech, while the right side tends to be more visual processing and artistic processing and image processing and stuff like that. However, everyone has a functioning right and left side. Everyone has functioning things on both sides of your brain. No one's right brain or left brain. However, we also found that these processes, though they typically tend to be associated with either the right side or left side of your brain, we do find that different parts of your brain may devote more resources to certain activities, and we do find that there is a lot of neuroplasticity allowed. It's a little bit more limited as you become an adult, more fixed, but especially if you do undergo drastic brain changes at a young age, things that typically be found on the right side shift over to the left side of the brain. So here's a classic example of that. This person, if you watch the video that's linked here, had surgery where she lost half her brain. That's a major surgery that scoops out part of your brain in order to cure, again, really severe seizures that keeps the kid from processing. And because these procedures are done on very young kids typically, before process have been set or in stone in the brain or been kind of more fixed in the brain, because the kids were so young and the brain was still growing and developing and the neurons were still being made or lengthened or processed to a degree, it allowed their neurons to their brain to reorganize, to shift all the activity they needed to one side. And for instance, you would think she would lose a huge amount of her processing ability, but in fact, most of her motor function and intellect and stuff remains intact, with just some weakness on the side that is lost. All right, so now we're going to go into major lobes of your brain. So within your cerebrum itself, there are different lobes, and each of those lobes also typically are associated with certain processes. Okay? So here's another image of that. So we have the dark blue, which is the temporal lobe. This is the front of your brain, the pink part, and that is your frontal lobe. So imagine your eyeballs are over here. Okay? This section over here is what's known as your parietal lobe. And, or actually, I colored it wrong. This section over here is your parietal lobe. And then this back section over here is your occipital lobe. Okay? So that's sort of your visual. And you have this on your left side and your right side of your brain. Okay, so your parietal lobe is most associated with what is known as your somatic sensory or somatosensory area. Basically, it takes in information, sense information that's not associated with specific senses in your, I would say, in your face, or it doesn't process it. It processes touch and feeling. It doesn't process associations related to sight, hearing, tasting, or smelling. But the feeling part of your sensations, it processes a lot of those. Pain, cold, light touch, and stuff like that. Now again, don't forget, because of those cross pathways, the left side of your brain will receive the impulses from the right side of your body and vice versa. So if you have an itch on your right hand, it's interpreted on the left side of the somatic sensory area, and then that left side is going to have to send that information to other parts of your brain to help process movement to, like, maybe scratch that itch or stop whatever's making you itch. All right, so the occipital lobe, the back of your brain, that is your visual area. I kind of know this because I used to snowboard and stuff, and when I used to smack my head really hard, depending on the side of my brain, especially on the back side of my brain though, my vision would sometimes white out, and that's because that is your visual processing area. So it processes your actual sight, and it helps processes any emotions, memories, knowledge associated with those things you see. Now, the temporal lobe is your auditory area and your olfactory area. It processes sound and any feelings and knowledge associated with things you hear, as well as smell. Now, why is that? Well, if you look at the picture of those lobes, let me see if I can find the image here. Nope, not that. Here we go. If you look at the picture of your temporal lobe, kind of just touch your temples, and you'll notice your temple is right next to your ear. So this is located right nearby your ear. It's the most convenient location for having neurons that processes hearing. But in addition to that, if you take your ear and you cross to the opposite ear, just along a transverse plane, you're going to cross your nose, which means that this region also happens to be location-wise closer to your nose region, which is why the temporal lobe is more useful for processing hearing as well as smell. Now we're about to get into the frontal lobe now, and before we go into the frontal lobe, I want to introduce the structure that was briefly mentioned in the parietal lobe, but I forgot to really point it out. And it's this deep, well, not deep, but this groove here that's also known as the central sulcus, and it basically separates the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe. Now, if you look at it, there's a big wrinkle in the front and a big wrinkle in the back. The big wrinkle in the back is the primary area for processing sensation, while the front area is the primary area over here for processing motor movement. So it's nice that the two areas, the area for processing sensations and the area for processing movement, are side by side, even though one is in the parietal lobe while the other is in the frontal lobe. Because they're side by side, it's really easy for them to coordinate information between the two. Okay, so in the frontal lobe, again, it has that primary motor region, which helps you allow for control of your skeletal muscle. So if you sense something with your parietal area behind it in the blue region, you'll be like, oh, I want to smack it. Send the information to the red region for your primary motor area, and then you can smack whatever's making you itch. Now, the Broca's area, which is a region within the frontal lobe, also has your ability to speak, your ability for you to talk to others, but it's found more in the left side. And in addition, your frontal lobe, the really part, like said, makes it kind of scary, and I'll explain why I consider it kind of scary, is that it's the area of your brain that's most associated with your intellect, with your ability to take in and process and react emotionally and intellectually towards information. It also helps and is associated with socially acceptable behaviors, your social and emotional responses to things and such and stuff like that. It also allows for language comprehension, your ability to take in information from the world and process it and make an emotional or intellectual response to it. That's all in your frontal lobe. Basically, who you are and your personality is in your frontal lobe. In addition to that, because it's in your frontal lobe, if you look at it, it's kind of closest to your mouth. So it also has a huge role in your ability to taste. But the reason why I point out the frontal lobe's association with all your thoughts and stuff like that, as well as its association with movement and such as that, is that historically there was like this really popular psychiatric surgical treatment to patients in the mid 1900s called lobotomy. And what they did was they took basically a giant needle and they poked it not through the eye but behind the eye, because behind your eye is a hole in your skull that leads to the brain, and they basically swirled it in the front of your brain. So for patients that had really uncontrolled emotions and who were difficult to control in a psychiatric hospital, doing this procedure basically lowered their emotional responses, made it very hard for them to get emotional or upset about their situation. And that made them much easier to handle in a hospital, or not even necessarily a hospital, in a mental institution at the time. But you also destroyed who that person was. And sometimes these people, all they needed was maybe medication, maybe a more safe setting. Maybe they didn't even have a major issue, but they just were acting in a way that wasn't deemed socially acceptable at that time. And it was a big deal. So if you're interested in the history of that, this video that's linked to here, you can watch that and learn more about it. Now, another thing I wanted to point out is within those regions that control sensation, that band of tissue behind the central sulcus that helps you process sensory information, or the band of tissue in front of the central sulcus that helps you do motor movement, and anywhere within your brain, there's a lot of different areas within those sections that are devoted to specific regions of your body. And what people have done is they were able to map those areas and associate them with certain parts of your body. This brain mapping is known as what we call cortical, like your brain cortex, homunculus meaning mapping. And it was mapping your areas of your brain to parts of your body and what they control. So this kind of scary looking dude is just showing how much of your brain is associated with different parts of your body. So a lot more of your brain is devoted to movement of your hands, for instance, and movement of your mouth, for instance, than other parts of your body. And the reason why that is because fine motor control of our hands and speech and ability to communicate with one another is a huge part of what has allowed humans to be very successful. And that's why you kind of see these images where it looks like a huge component of your body is associated with sensations in either your arms or your face. Now, a thing about this is mapping that typically happens, but it isn't the same from person to person. There's always slight differences between person to person that can change over time, and that there's still ability for shifts to happen, especially early on in age, if there's, for instance, damage in your brain or surgery in your brain. And when you're older, those accumulated changes can make a huge difference if they're doing brain surgery on you. So this is a big reason why brain mapping individuals is still a really important part of brain surgery, where they have to keep you awake when they do brain surgery in order to figure out the exact parts of your brain that are associated with different motions or activities. So if you are a person who finds that speech is really important to you, that a certain hobby like guitar playing is really important to you, they'll keep you awake and while they do brain surgery on you and ask you to do certain things so that they ensure that they don't accidentally cut into a part that's really important to preserve for the patient. So if you're curious in looking into these things, you can watch these videos here, and some of them are quite graphic, which are surgical videos of brain surgery being done and mapping being done on patients. All right, and here are some pictures of parts of your brain that are associated with different sensory information. But for our purposes of our lesson, you mainly just want to know the notes portion that we went over in the written section. All right, and over here, this is a nice, very nice, clean summary of all the cerebrum functions and of those lobes and what they're associated with. All right, and so our takeaways here, though, is the cerebrum is made of those 4 lobes. The frontal lobe especially is associated with your higher thought and primary motor cortex, while the parietal lobe is really associated with your somatosensory cortex for processing sensory input information. Remember, afferent info is info coming in, while temporal lobe is associated with auditory information as well as your ability to process auditory information, while the occipital lobe is very associated with visual information. All right, and that concludes the lesson, and you can move on. Bye.